My one big thing this week, Goldman Sachs, the 154-year-old financial services behemoth, maybe the most recognizable name in banking and financial services in the world, and the second largest investment bank by revenue in the world, behind only JP Morgan Chase. Goldman Sachs published an article earlier this week entitled "How Saudi Arabia is Investing to Transform Its Economy." The article highlighted how Saudi Arabia's focus on diversifying its economy beyond oil is showing results. The piece discusses a little bit about the kingdom's national investment strategy, a plan to transform its economy through additional support for innovation, incentives to boost private sector contributions, and targeted support for strategic sectors. Analysts estimate that around $1 trillion, part of the overall estimated NIS investments of $3.3 trillion, could be spent through the end of the decade on preliminary investments in 6 specific sectors, which Goldman Sachs research identifies as areas that are benefiting from increased investment and are likely to drive a, quote, capex supercycle through the end of the decade. And those 6 sectors are, and will sound familiar to our regular listeners as they are frequent topics on this podcast, clean tech, with Saudi Arabia planning to add close to 60 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity and 2 to 3 gigawatts of nuclear energy capacity by 2030, with an investment estimate of $206 billion. You have mining, minerals, and metals, total investment estimate $170 billion. Transportation and logistics, $150 billion. Digital transformation, $147 billion. Upstream energy, $245 billion. Downstream energy, $100 billion. And Goldman Sachs sort of describes some of the investments specifically in these 6 sectors. And so it kind of goes into that a little bit. We're going to share, of course, a link to this report. It's publicly available on Goldman Sachs' website. And it's just sort of an interesting look and an interesting perspective. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. The report's author, Goldman Sachs research analyst Faisal Al-Azma, notes that in addition to the progress made, he said, quote, "We also expect more strategies and announcements as initial targets are met, supported by further technological breakthroughs across sectors." The report does go into greater details on what the NIS is, how it works, and other programs related to it, like Sharik, a program we've discussed on this podcast, a 2021 program that aims to increase domestic investment made by listed and non-listed private sector companies to $1.3 trillion by 2030. Al-Azma concludes the post for Goldman Sachs research with this, quote, "Since the launch of Vision 2030 and in 2016, Saudi Arabia has made meaningful strides in growing the non-oil economy through various developments and investments across strategic economic sectors. Investment plans are likely to develop further in tandem with technological progress and availability over time as sector strategies are finalized." So that's the report. It's from Goldman Sachs. And, maybe the word milestone is somewhat overused these days. But if Vision 2030 is like a long, challenging hike up a summit, with the end being a diversified economy, and at the top you have a worldview for Saudi Arabia that is impressive, then I think this report and the reality it discusses, more importantly, is sort of like a milestone on that journey. The reforms of Vision 2030 have not been easy, nor have they been inexpensive, and it is an uphill climb to the finish, just as it was at the start. I mean, if you're on this hike, this metaphorical hike, you're turning around at this point and you're Saudi Arabia and you're seeing a view that looks very different than when you started. The view when Saudi Arabia started and launched this journey up the mountain was at the base of the mountain. Naysayers and doubters were on the same level as Saudi Arabia, saying they can't make it, they shouldn't start, doubting the path that they were taking. Those voices are now below you, still on the ground, still probably doubting, but are now farther away and definitely way below Saudi Arabia at this point on its journey. And this is the point in a hike or a run when you can use your progress as validation and find a second wind, continue ahead, skip the chance to rest, and skip a chance to take a breather and push forward. And this is a moment where Saudi Arabia can look at the progress and feel good about it, direction that it's on, and use that as fuel to keep going. Because, Richard, they're halfway through this thing. And what Goldman Sachs is saying in this report is that it's working, but there's more to go and they need to keep going. And the hill ahead is just as steep as it was as they were just on. It's just important you take these sort of milestones. And again, this case is a Goldman Sachs research report. Excuse me. I don't know why this keeps happening, highlighting your progress and keep going forward. And so, you take this report and you sort of step back, put it in the context of the Crown Prince's interview with Fox just a few weeks ago, recently, where he talked about what they have done in Saudi Arabia, but he also discussed where they're going. And you kind of have to feel pretty optimistic about the direction. It's not over, but the direction is in the right direction. They are definitely going forward. They are looking back a little bit and saying, "Hey, we've got some progress here." And this report really crystallizes and highlights that. And I also say, as an American, and we are friends to Saudi Arabia. We study this country. We like it. We both are fortunate to have many Saudi friends, but we are both Americans. And the diversification of Saudi Arabia's economy and the modernization of its society is absolutely in America's best interest, in my opinion. And just think about the alternative. These are reforms that are, the United States has encouraged Saudi Arabia to make for years and decades. And now you have a major U.S. investment bank, maybe the marquee U.S. investment bank in the world, in a research note saying these reforms are happening and they're continuing and they're working. So it's just cool. I mean, we've done segments like this before, but you just read this and you step back from it and say, man, this is kind of something. These Vision 2030 is working. The diversification is underway. There's more to go, but it's kind of, things are trending in the right direction for Saudi Arabia right now. And it's good to see. And I just encourage them to keep going.
Yeah, I get the same thing over here.
I think it's the fall sort of throat scunge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So many thoughts. The first one is that was very uplifting.
Yeah, a sermon.
Have you considered a Peloton trainer career?
I have considered that. I need to get a Peloton, right? Probably need to work out a little more.
But it's in there. It's absolutely in there. Yes. I it is a very good article, and it is, and we, since we're so deep in this every day, none of it's new, but like you say, it's meaningful when a Goldman Sachs says it. And I do want to do a shout out to the 966. We did a one big thing on the national investment strategy in December 2021. So that was one of our earliest one big things. I only offer that because this is, we've been on this for a long time and it's a big deal. And, it includes, that national investment strategy has goals of $3.3 trillion. 1.3 of that is from the Sharik program, which is the private sector involvement. There are people who have signed up for that. We'll see if they get there. A big deal is $480 billion, or 15% of this from foreign direct investments. And that's the area where they need to see some more progress. And I will say on the PIF, and it's committing $800 billion. But this is folding into a conversation we had last week about how pleased I am, and I think we both are, that in this year of a projected budget deficit of 1.2%, it hasn't slowed their spending. They're still just going at it real hard because they believe in it and they think it's required now. And so anyway, all these things all sort of fold in together, which is very encouraging. And I would say one last thing, and this is not, it's an observation, but it's because it's a fact. When we say halfway to 2030, chronologically, it's a fact. But realistically, as we're going up that mountain, that metaphoric mountain, it doesn't stop at 2030. 2030 is just a waypoint, and to be honest, for Saudis, it's probably like a staging point on a Himalayan, it's at
like another base camp, or
it's a base camp. What I'm saying is 2030 has been the mark, but because you have to put a mark.
Mm-hmm.
But so much of their stuff is going to be going well beyond that. New things are going to be introduced, later in this decade, that the terminus or the projected terminus will be 2040 or whatever. So I think you're absolutely right. We're halfway through Vision 2030, but you see Saudi Arabia like upgrading their goals for tourists from 100 million to 150 million. You see them going, okay, this is the glide path we're on. This is the trajectory we want to see. but we're just not cutting it off at 2030. It's going to go well beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the mountain is not a stationary mountain, but at the top of the mountain, there's a volcanic sort of outcropping that creates a bigger mountain as it goes. But still, you have to get up to the mountain. You have to go up the mountain to get to that new mountain to climb.
I think this is the point where the show goes off the rails.
I mean, I agree. I mean, as a new motivational speaker and Peloton instructor, the reason why I feel positive when I read this is because, as you noted, it is Goldman Sachs. I mean, it is a brand name saying this. This isn't a local English language newspaper that is saying this. Everything's going great. I mean, this is like a bank that would absolutely say things are not going well if they weren't. And so, Richard, we sort of take we have a view of Saudi Arabia that is, I think, maybe more open-minded than a general American audience is. And that's, I think, what makes a podcast popular is more people are getting curious about it. But we wouldn't be this positive back in 2016 or 2015. We wouldn't take an unnecessarily positive view. And we are somewhat critical when they do things and we think maybe that's not in their best interest, but we also understand that, we're on the outside looking in. But you just sort of read this and you're like, man, they're Goldman Sachs is saying like this thing's on the right track. So keep climbing up the mountain, folks. Don't stop and smell the roses. Keep going.
I first went to Saudi in the 80s. I certainly was interested in the region before then. My dad worked the region in Africa, and obviously I've worked there, and we've been involved in it and paid a close attention to it. And I think we have a pretty good grasp of many aspects of it, insofar as Americans can have. I can say without a doubt that the Vision 2030 is the best narrative Saudi Arabia has ever had. And that when we talk about it, it's as I've said before, I think we both agree, the timing of the 966 is perfect because the Saudi story has gotten really interesting and more diverse, more active. The topic flow is greater. Everything is moving at a faster pace, and so much of it is of a more positive nature. So easily, Vision 2030 is the best narrative that Saudi Arabia has ever had, in my experience.
Completely agree. And they just have to keep it going.
Yes. And you know what? You know what they have to do? Sorry to interrupt, but it's something I actually mentioned this. I can't even give too much information, but after a major crisis some years ago, a senior Saudi, reached out for commentary and advice, and, and a bunch of other little blather that I'm sure I provided. One of the things I said, and the most important thing I said, look, you just need to do the work. And that is the work of Vision 2030. Just do the work. You forget about the atmospherics, forget about the reporting, forget about the judgment or the perceptions. If you do the work that is inherent in Vision 2030 and the national NTP, National Transformation Program, if you do the work, good things will happen. And they're doing the work. Absolutely, they're doing the work.
Yep, and the work will speak for itself as well.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what you do. So we're doing the work. This is all we really need to say.